for Mike Sweatman, our CEO and chairman, who was called away on a family emergency challenge. And so it's really a lucky thing for me, because it's my great pleasure to get to introduce our keynote speaker. And I'm going to introduce him, and then we'll turn the program over to Yona, as we always do. Thank you all for joining us here today, and I think that this seminar today and the discussion with the superb panel that's been put together will be not only very interesting, but certainly very timely, given what's going on today in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere in the many troubled regions of Asia and the Middle East and the like. And it's my particular privilege to get to introduce Ambassador Ronald Newman today. He really needs no introduction to any student of the topic that we're going to cover today. He's been a distinguished member of the State Department, the Foreign Service, and of course has been the ambassador to 3 different countries, Algeria, for example, Afghanistan, and Bahrain. He has been an Assistant Deputy Secretary of State, and he's had many, many key positions throughout his long service with the State Department, starting in 1970. Before that, and very, very important to me, of course, he was a combat infantryman in the Army. He served as an infantry officer in Vietnam and earned, amongst other medals, the Bronze Star, the Army Commendation Medal, and of course wears the Special Combat Infantry badge that all infantrymen sort of treasure. We don't wear those badges in the Marine Corps. We don't allow any badges. We think the Marine emblem's enough, but the Army needs a little help, and so they have all these badges and stuff like that. I couldn't resist throwing that in there, but just remember, you only kid people when you like them. I think that the ambassador's critical role that he played in Iraq and Baghdad with his various assignments, and well, of course, recently in Afghanistan, all of that, it really makes him a treasure trove of information, and we're just so proud that he could join us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, boss.
Well, Al, General, thank you. You know, actually, I had the pleasure, privilege of actually serving under the Marines, because I was in the only Army unit in Vietnam, the 1st Brigade, the 5th Mech, that was up to the operational control of the Marines. I have to say, I learned 2 things there. The Marines shared totally everything they had, and I learned that 50% of nothing is nothing, because they were seriously under-equipped. It was not their fault. Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and I appreciate it. Your subject today is really gigantic, security in the whole region. And this is, if you're not awfully careful, this becomes an invitation to sort of roam across the whole place saying something about everything, but I'm afraid at the end of that one may have said nothing about much of anything. I would like to be able to set out for you some glowing and brilliant conceptual approach to the area from the northern Indian border to the eastern border of the of Russia. Unfortunately, I don't have one. In fact, I don't believe there is one, because this is a period of really intensive instability and of multiple challenges coming from multiple directions and tearing people's attention from one corner to another. This is not just true of Washington, where there's a certain resemblance in the higher levels of policy making in Washington to small children playing soccer, that everybody rushes for the ball at the moment and nobody plays any other field. And we're experiencing that right now, so that between, first it was Syria, then it was Ukraine, now today it's Iraq. We have a policy statement on Afghanistan, but it hardly has any focus. And so we snap back and forth, and we're in such a period now. But what I will try to do is sketch out a few kind of what I would call base points or reference points around which one might try to organize thinking about the security prospects in the region, and to talk just a little about the idea of regional stabilization, regional agreements, both economic and political, about which I think one has to be extremely cautious not to exaggerate what they can do or how quickly they can do it, or whether they can do it at all. The future of Afghanistan is one of great question mark. It's one on which people don't agree, including Afghans. It is highly confused because of the lack of clarity in American policy, and that infects everybody else. And I want to come back also to talk about American policy in a minute, because we are in so many respects the large elephant in the room. And the result of America being as powerful as it is that to some extent we influence everybody else's actions. Friends, enemies, neutrals, all to some extent take position based on what they think the United States is going to do. When they don't know what that is, then they make assumptions. Those are usually worst-case assumptions from their own point of view, and so the results of uncertainty and insecurity are often unfortunate. Let me come back to that in a minute, but look, just as you look across the region, you have either a new or a reinvigorated Russian approach to Central Asia. And it's very evident from people are now looking at Georgia in 2008, the Ukraine being, the Crimea being swallowed up now, pressures on eastern Ukraine, the pressure on the Central Asian states to join an economic unit. And there's a question about how far does Russia intend to go in pressing other states into, not back into a territorial embrace. They're not trying to recreate the Soviet Union, I don't think, but they clearly intend to dominate politically in areas close to them, that which they so charmingly call the near abroad. And that is making the Central Asian states and a lot of other, and the Eastern Europeans, but fortunately that's not my subject for today, but it's making people nervous. It's drawing their attention away from other areas to focus on how bad is this pressure going to be. And that's particularly true, for instance, in Kyrgyzstan, where you have the only other democracy functioning. I'm saying the only other because now you begin to have one in Afghanistan. Now that's a huge sweep of territory when one is critical of whatever the blemishes are in these democracies, to think that from the northern border of India to the western border of Russia, these are the only two more or less democratic states, and I exclude Pakistan because of the role of the military, which excludes the civilian power from dominance in so many of the most critical issues. So you have Central Asia looking over its shoulder at Russia. You have Russia slightly schizophrenic about the United States and Afghanistan. They don't really like us being there in sense of the challenge it poses in Central Asia, but they also really don't want an unstable Afghanistan and a rebuilding of an Islamic fundamentalist, lousy word, but an extremist, Islamic extremist movements coming up against the borders of Central Asia. And so, because of what they don't want, they have been very helpful in a variety of things, rescheduling the huge Afghan debt, permitting a growing amount of transport of military supplies across Central Asia, relieving pressure, which at one point they were doing on air bases in Manas and in Uzbekistan, and allowing a lot of freight to go across. At the same time, they've never allowed munitions to go across. So it's all combat equipment, but not anything that shoots. Nothing goes bang comes in by the Northern Transportation Line. It all comes by air over Pakistan. And that is also an important point. So you've got Russia slightly schizophrenic, pushing into Central Asia, but not wanting us to lose, but not wanting us to be too big in Afghanistan. You've got a Pakistan which is itself somewhat unstable. I don't believe it is anywhere close to collapsing, but which is engaged in increasingly a major war with its own Islamic movement and yet trying to maintain support for others in Afghanistan. It is very unclear what Pakistan's long-term policies will evolve to. There is a lot of discussion about changes in Pakistani attitude, and I've seen some of that discussion in terms of, oh my God, we don't want real breakdown in Afghanistan, we don't want to deal with the refugee flow again, we've got enough economic crisis. But I have to say that none of that discussion over the last year or more seems to have been evidenced in an actual change of policy or action. And until I think there was a period of considerable enthusiasm where we began to hear these sorts of discussions, and that's kind of cooled because it didn't allow much. Now, you have had the election of a civilian government. You've had a peaceful transition of power, which is pretty important. But it is not at all clear that that government has the ability to change major Pakistani policy vis-a-vis either India or Afghanistan. It is also, I think, important to understand that Pakistan's policy is also heavily influenced by what it expects the United States to do. And I think that this is true of all the countries, but it's particularly clear here. Americans often say about any number of situations, well, what's their vision? In Afghanistan, what's their vision of what the future should be? It's important to stop and understand that that comment is intensely, inherently American. It comes out of being part of a very strong state with enormous power, because underneath that statement of what is their vision is the idea that you can have a vision because you have enough power and enough strength to bring about a vision if you want to put that energy into it. That is not the starting point from which the vast majority of states in the world address foreign policy. They address it from what is the situation with which I have to deal. And within that situation, particularly the dangers, what can I do about those dangers? And then there may be an element of vision, but it is within the context of what is it that I cannot do anything about that I have to deal with. So for the Pakistanis, one key starting point in that view of the world is the belief that we're going to move out of Afghanistan too early and let it collapse. As General Kiani, the former chief of staff, said to General Allen at one point, and I think he said it to others, I expect you will leave too early, you will underfund the Afghan security forces, they will collapse, and we will deal with chaos. So to say to them in that condition, don't you see how important a stable Afghanistan is sort of like saying, wouldn't it be nice if you could fly? Well, yeah, so what? It's an irrelevant statement from the power position of those dealing with the situation. Now, you might argue their policies are wrong. They don't give them the stability they want, various other things. But its starting point is you have to change the world that they think they see if you want them to change their view of how they deal with it. I won't go into India, but you have a new government in India, and obviously how it approaches things will also be difficult. I'm just going to two base points, one about China and one about India, because I don't want to spend all the time just sort of making the circumference. China has considerable interest in Afghanistan. It worries more. I think it is clear that China is worrying more about Afghanistan. It is worrying about what will happen if you have an Islamist connection there that connects to Chinese insurgents. That worry does not yet translate into any particular policy of action. And I don't think it will. Maybe it will eventually, but I see no evidence of it now. I was recently at a conference in Beijing, and one Chinese professor somewhat ruefully summed up Chinese policy. He said, I believe China's policy in Afghanistan will remain cautious passivity. And I think that's what you got. So I think one should not build any theoretical or policy frameworks on the assumption you can get China to play a much larger role in Afghanistan. In many ways, I wish it were true, because I don't think they're a particularly hostile force for any of our interests, but I don't think it is true. So, and then the last thing I want to mention there before talking a little bit about Afghanistan itself and about regionalism is the role of Iran. And again, very complex subject. We've got all kinds of other issues with Iran. But I think there are a couple of base points. Iran is potentially a minor political problem in Afghanistan, but not a strategic threat. It is Afghanistan in Iranian eyes is extremely different from Iraq. And since we have so much experience with Iran in Iraq, which is negative, particularly as they built shaped charges and blew up our vehicles and killed our people, one needs to understand the difference. Iraq, historically for Iran, is a strategic threat. It has been the source of strategic threat since the 8th century Battle of Karbala. It has never changed. When I served in Iran in the 1970s before the revolution, and I served up in Tabriz in the west, every year Iranian forces in western Iran, in Kermanshah and Rezaieh, drilled an exercise premised on the Iraqi invasion of Iran, falling back, regrouping, blunting the invasion and the counterattack. This was their regular paradigm in the 1970s under the Shah. They fought an 8-year war with Iraq. They do not have an interest in a stable Iraq. They have an interest in Iraq which is not in total chaos. They don't want it dominated by hostile Sunni Islamists. But a stable Iraq will ultimately be in all probability, an Iranian threat, and that includes a Shia Iraq. Because a Shia-dominated Iraq, which is really stable and which does not need Iranian support desperately, will also be an Arab Iraq. And that will be the same Iraq in which the Shia fought as members of the Iraqi army for 8 very bloody years without any major defection. Afghanistan, in contrast, is not a strategic threat to Iran. The last time it was a strategic threat was probably when Ahmad Shah Durrani took the treasure that Nadir Shah had after his assassination in 1747 and went off and made himself king. Afghanistan is a source of minor threats. The Iranians worry about us in Afghanistan. They're very sensitive about what we do on the border. They tend to impute various motives to us which make them very nervous. I think it was a mistake that we cut off communication with them in Afghanistan. I had perhaps the last conversation with them in Afghanistan that was officially sanctioned, and then I was told I had to shut that down because of the nuclear pressures. I think that's a mistake because it just made them more suspicious about what we were doing. And we have overlapping interests in Afghanistan. They have a huge narcotics problem in Iran, both a transshipment and a problem of addiction. Most of the narcotics that cause that come from Afghanistan. There's an area of cooperation there. They cooperated extensively with us in 2001, both in the overthrow of the Taliban and in the negotiations that followed. To say we have overlapping interests is not to say the interests are all the same. Those two statements should not be confused. But the point is we do have things we can cooperate with. The Iranians will always try for influence because they don't like threats and because it's a kind of natural primordial relation of most politicians, except those who think the 21st century is different. But otherwise, it does not mean they are striving for hegemony. Those are issues much more of the Gulf and of Iraq than they are of Afghanistan. So there is potential for cooperation. So to just close out that, before I go on for about 3 minutes more, I hope, you have bifurcated Russian policies. You have Central Asian states which are concerned about what happens in Afghanistan but do not see themselves as having, by and large, the power to actually influence it, and whose attention is increasingly taken by pressures from Russia. So they are not likely to be the source of large actions or daring actions. You have China, which is largely inactive. You have Pakistan, which is more negative than positive. Iran, which can be worked with, but is not pushing hard for anything in particular. The overarching element in this, or perhaps I should say it's more like the hole in the donut because it's conspicuous by its absence, is U.S. policy. What is our policy toward Central Asia? How much does our desire for democracy and support for democracy, which irritates the hell out of the Russians, how does that balance against our need for Central Asian support in Afghanistan, which requires a certain measure of Russian acquiescence, at least? If we can't sort out, that doesn't mean one has to always have priority, but if we cannot find a way of expressing the balance between those policies, everybody worries that whatever it is they don't like is what we're doing. In Afghanistan, you have this constant tension between the commitment of forces and the establishment of dates, which undercut things because Afghans think things will fall apart, and therefore they look to their own survival instead of to larger issues of building the state or building the army. There's a lot of success right now. I think what one can say in the aftermath of the second round of the elections, but we still, cross your fingers, have to get through a vote count without major battles over fraud, but basically the Army has performed well in security. There is much too much that has been done to say nothing has been done, the way some critics do. It's all wasted. That's nonsense. But what has been done is not sufficient to ensure success, and it is not sustainable without continued American, particularly financial support, but some degree of military involvement, which for the Afghans is also key psychologically. So that it is also nonsense to say that you are on some glide path to success. You're neither. And you're neither in a war which is so complex. It reminds me of Vietnam in a sense. If you have a really strong view about Afghanistan, as was true in Vietnam, you can go to the country, you can find the pieces that will support the argument you brought with you. You can then go back and write the article that said, I was there and this is the way it is. And then somebody whose view is completely and totally opposite can go there and do the same thing. And that, of course, makes it a little difficult to have informed policy discussions. But the bilateral security agreement will be signed. I have absolutely no doubt about that. And I think it will be signed probably within the next 3 months. We will have troops there at least into the end of 2016. It would be nice if we had more clarity of policy beyond that, because the expectations of what we will or won't do affect what Pakistan does. They affect what Iran does. They affect how Afghans relate to their own state. They affect the degree of risk people will take to build that state, vice line their pocket, and expect to run away. Unfortunately, we're not answering those questions. We're particularly not answering them with the latest decision that all troops will leave after 2016 and our security advisory presence will fold back inside the embassy. You should, by the way, understand this is a very plastic statement. You can have quite a large security training presence inside a U.S. embassy. Saudi Arabia will have a 2-star command with a large training mission, and then one almost as large training the Saudi National Guard with retired military who operate under contract. So, in fact, saying you'll have an embassy presence doesn't really tell you what you're going to do. It's a kind of way of hiding it, but it scares the hell out of the Afghans. And it also suggests to people who you send in uniform that we need you to go and accept a certain degree of risk, but by the way, we don't really give a damn whether you succeed or fail because we're going to end the mission anyway. That is a very bizarre way in which to inspire your forces to take risk. So, 2 final comments on regional strategies. I would say that there's been a lot of discussion about the need for regional strategies in 2 respects. One is the neutralization of Afghanistan, and the other is to build regional economic ties. neutralization in the sense that Afghanistan has had its longest period of stability from 1929 to 1979, basically, when it was essentially neutral. And so many people dream of recreating this. And it may be a good idea, and someday it may happen. But it will not happen soon. It cannot happen soon because it cannot, in my judgment, obviously these are judgmental questions, but it cannot, in my judgment, happen until you have a government in Afghanistan that is strong enough to keep basic order. As long as you have other forces contending violently for power, they will inevitably draw in other foreigners to support them. And if Afghanistan begins to break down from what it is now, if American support really goes away, then you will have a much larger foreign presence. And it won't be because people expect to win. It will be because they think it is critical that their allies not lose. So the Pakistanis will be even more heavily invested in the Islamist insurgents because they want, at a minimum, to control the areas around their own border, and they fear Indian building. The Indians will be involved because they fear that those areas will become again the training ground for terrorists as they were in the past with Lashkar-e-Taiba, other groups. The Iranians will become involved because they don't want a group of fanatics on their border, and they remember that their diplomats were massacred in Mazar-e-Sharif when the Taliban took it. The Russians will become involved because of the same reason. They don't want a fundamentalist Islamist state on the borders of Central Asia. None of that drawing in would lead to victory. It could give you something that looked like Lebanon's civil war, which lasted for 15 years, and Lebanon is much smaller, and there were fewer outside parties, and they weren't as nasty. That's a pretty comparative statement. So this is really something to worry about because it has potential for enormous instability. Until you have reduced that potential by the strength of the central government in Afghanistan, I do not think you can get a regional cooperation agreement. You could get an agreement, but it would be an agreement on paper. It would not hold, and it would not, in the old saying, be worth the paper it's written on. There is enormous potential for regional economic cooperation, but as the old Kurdish leader Mullah Mustafa Barzani said to me once about another subject, I've often heard of this bird, but I've never seen it fly. There are a number of reasons for that, and I won't go through them all. The benefits of regional economic cooperation are huge. The impediments are also large. Some of it comes out of people's mentality, status mentality. It was enormously interesting to watch the Central Asian states gradually accept the idea of sealed cargo passage across Central Asia with our military supplies going to Afghanistan. This is something we've talked about for years. It's essential. And then you see these trucks on the road say TIR, Transit International Routier. It's an international system of sealed cargoes moving around so that you can ship goods easily across countries. Not accepted in the East. It's a whole new way of thinking. And there's a certain amount of, oh, that's what they meant. But it's still very, very new. And so there are all kinds of impediments. I hope it will develop. Certainly the economic case for it is very strong. The economic case for it is also irrelevant in large part to overcoming the political obstacles. Irrelevant may be too strong a term, but I wanted to give you a sense of the difficulty of this. I think there's an enormous amount of room for academic, what people often call track 2 discussion of regional economic cooperation, because it's something that should happen. But it needs to move beyond praise for how good it would be to a much more detailed examination of what the problems are, because people's minds in government aren't open to that yet. So there's a very fertile field to be explored there on how you would do customs regulation, how you would make it in a way that you have faith that you're not just opening the doors to smuggling, how you would handle your border controls, what you would do about letting drivers from other countries pass across your country. And that's just, 3 issues out of a myriad of technical issues. But those all need discussion, because in the day when some of this becomes more possible and more realistic, those questions will need to be answered. And the only place they're going to be discussed now is outside of government, because the governments aren't ready to discuss them seriously. So I think there is a fertile field there for that, but it is also not yet. So I leave you with this thought that there are all sorts of contending forces. It's very difficult. If we really screw it up, it can be much worse, which ought to be an incentive to remaining involved, even though it's been a long war and we're tired. There are hopes for the future, but they are not immediate, and they need work, and they need diplomacy, and they need attention. Thank you very much.
You have a question, or we still can use the time for maybe a question or comment?
Yeah. Well, you want me to?
Well, if you...
You're abdicating your responsibilities.
Yeah, no, don't worry.
Because everybody's telling you you're great around here. I've always thought your performance is just adequate, myself. And of course, that's like a Legion of Merit in the Air Force. But at any rate, okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for a really stimulating conversation or a keynote address. And there's no question that there are a lot of complex issues. It's always bothered me personally a little bit that, ever since World War II, we've kind of led the drive around the world for democracies. And, of course, democracies, it takes a couple hundred years of education and a couple hundred years of experience sometimes to make it work. We forget that not every nation is prepared for a Jeffersonian-type democracy and the like, and we also forget that we had 200 years of colonial experience before we made the great step forward. And in this day and age, there are many nations that really don't want a democratic state or nation on their borders, and that's one of the big issues all along. And so whether you have some kind of republic or Islamic republic or something like that, that may be a lesser alternative that's more satisfactory at this time. But at any rate, I could go on this topic, but the timing is really your time. So do we have any questions or comments from... yes, sir.
The question is directly to the foreign policy of the United States of America. Nowadays, we have global problems. So global problems need a global solutions, and American solutions sometimes is not a global solution, because we have to protect our interests and foresee that our democracy and the other ways of preferred life that we have experienced, as he said, 400 years. So in the past 40 years, we have met with lots of disastrous experience, defeat, and loss of treasure and blood. So what is the new outlook? Are we going to change our attitude toward the world, or are we just going to continue with the same attitude that you were taught?
I truly wish I could give you a simple answer to that question. I don't think I can. We've had mixed experience. I mean, if you look at the period since the end of the Cold War, we've had some brilliant successes. The unification of Germany was a brilliant diplomatic success, for which I think the first President Bush deserves a lot of credit for. The repulse of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait was a brilliant diplomatic success, both in its creating of a huge alliance of very disparate powers, and in the fact that we got many of those powers to help pay for it. The last war we ran at a profit. We have not had similar success in Iraq, which is pretty much a disaster right now. Afghanistan, after all, was not a war of choice. We were attacked and 3,000 people died. Maybe a lot of mistakes, but I don't think the mistake was to go to Afghanistan. To have left the Taliban in Afghanistan unchallenged, or to have gone in and then simply left the country to go back to chaos and feuding of the Mujahideen leaders in Pakistan would, I think, have been a much worse decision than what we did. And I think so. Part of the answer to the question, of course, is we have to choose within the choices we have, and not the ones we would like. Now, the Obama administration seems to have embarked on a somewhat different approach. There's some very interesting writing by Robert Kagan that compares it to the policies of the 1920s and 30s, where we were not so much isolationist as we defined American interests in a very narrow sense. If something was not a direct threat to us, then it was not a threat. The result of that, of course, was disastrous. We must have a secure Western Europe that shares goals and ideas. And you can argue about whether that definition is equally applicable to the events of today. But I think what you're seeing is that when the United States draws back too far and creates too much doubt about what it will do and where it will intervene, that the doubt itself becomes a negative. And so now we have to find a way forward. I think if we continue to view Ukraine and Syria and everything else pretty much as not a threat to our interests, so we won't be involved, that is not a path to policy success. And if we think we can run around reforming the whole world through the military, that obviously isn't. In a sense, you can tell I'm out of government. You know, President Obama's last speech, now this is very personal, but his last speech at West Point is a good discussion of issues, which is then followed by setting up two completely unrealistic extremes, neither of which he intends to do, and then a vague statement about approach which does not seem to be geared to any particular action. That approach to policy is leading people to think we won't act. And there is room in that kind of, there are risks in that, because there are things on which I think this administration will act militarily. So there is also a risk of misperception, that people will think they can do things they will not be able to do without reaction. You know, how does China read Ukraine, Syria? That's not an irrelevant question. People who travel in Asia tell me there's a lot of discussion about what the United States can be counted on for. So when the Chinese are making decisions about whether to ram a Vietnamese boat, and the Vietnamese are making decisions about whether to shoot, and the Philippines are doing the same, and others, the idea of what role the United States will play, whether that role has a restraint or no restraint, is important. And so there are risks in being too involved, there's no question. But you can't make foreign policy on a bumper sticker. So there needs to be a more articulated definition of what we will do and what's important. Not always, I could do a riff on that, but you're seeing change now, perhaps you're seeing too much change. I think the number of disasters and the criticism of the administration will probably pull us back somewhere, but I don't know where. That was an awfully long answer to be as indefinite as it was.
Yeah. Yoni, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just we still have a few minutes before we move to the panel, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for your very profound insights. I have a question, because you mentioned correctly the success of international cooperation between the United States and the allies in regard to Kuwait, for example. And my question is, what role do you see in Central Asia for the European Union, or the European countries, and particularly the role of NATO in the future?
it's probably a better question than my answer. But, you know, NATO in Afghanistan has been something of a surprise because it's actually held together. There were a lot of questions about whether NATO could hold together. But you not only have 26 nations in NATO, you have a number of, quite a spread of troop-contributing nations. You have seen, albeit with lots of difference from country to country, there has been a huge evolution in German policy in NATO, where you have moved from virtually a total non-combat presence, huge parliamentary debates about sending 6 or 7 observation aircraft, to, you know, calling airstrikes, fighting, and moving about. Some people might like it to be more, but in terms of German political development, these are huge changes. And you've had about 40 troop-contributing nations overall, you know, from Georgia to United Arab Emirates. Quite a spread. I don't think NATO will gleefully embark on another out-of-area mission, and it certainly isn't going to challenge Russia in Central Asia. It does have a program of partnership for peace that allows for a certain number of exercises. I think that will continue, but I don't think it's terribly significant. I think NATO now has to deal with 2 broad geopolitical issues. One is in terms of the states that are within NATO, particularly the Baltics. Is NATO a military guarantee or not? If those, you know, if tomorrow Latvian, Russian, native Russian speakers say we are endangered and there is serious pressure from Russia, is NATO as a collectivity in the United States part of a military defense or not? I don't know the answer to that right now. The second issue with NATO in Afghanistan is, what are we doing? We've worked for a number of years to bring NATO into Afghanistan. We've maintained it. They've done, for all the problems, and I am intimately aware of a great many of them, they've held together. Now, we've announced we're out of here in 2016. As far as I know, we have not completed any consultations with NATO about what that decision means for NATO. Have we just ripped the rug out from under them? Are we still going to have a NATO mission, but we won't be part of it? We'll have a NATO mission, but we'll sort of be part of it, but our real military will be under. This kind of thing will leave consequences in NATO. So I think there is no NATO appetite to go to Central Asia beyond, Partnership for Peace, but the solidarity of the organization is going to have to be reaffirmed in discussions about, first, its purpose in the East, and secondly, where it's going in Afghanistan, how much people have responded to the United States and then find themselves out on a limb. I may be much too critical, but I don't see the Europeans taking a very strong role in Central Asia. They are having enormous troubles on the Ukrainian side figuring out how to put any pressure on Russia. They intensely dislike what the Russians are doing. They can't bring themselves to any kind of collective view of sanctions. The French are selling them an aircraft carrier, and the Italians are selling them planes. And those decisions may be good or bad, but they certainly indicate a lack of coherence. So a coherent European political role in Central Asia, I think, is a stretch. And sort of, what was Kissinger's comments? What's the telephone number of Europe? I think that is still lacking.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, based on my own experience with NATO many years ago, before all of you were born, but I remember being the NATO commander charged with the northern and southern flanks of NATO security, and I was initially amazed, but later I understood it. Many of the NATO political military meetings that we had, there was a strong knowledge of economics, and it was really a political and economic and a military organization. And I think we forget that sometimes. And I think that the solidarity of NATO and the fact that they have in place mechanisms to handle that could be allow for some optimism, but bear in mind that logistics kinds of issues always remain national. And so providing equipment, providing supplies, providing that kind of help is a national issue, even amongst the NATO community. So that's another aspect. Do we have any other questions? Yes, sir. Okay, one more question.
Thank you. You probably have two if I'd give a shorter
answer. When we're speaking about the foreign policy complexities, it's as if the foreign policy as carried out by the governments is a common denominator. There's another factor, and the question is, how significant is this other factor, which is mainly financial? When we speak about Iran in terms of regional and global, we say Iran. When we speak about Iran as a nation, it's the government, the supreme leadership, and the Republican Guard. The Republican Guard is mostly the economic side of it. My question, to be brief, is if we extend this concept to the other countries, to NATO, to the countries with which NATO is having to deal, how much of the complexity is unexplained when we go beyond this common denominator of governments working together and enter into the area of financial corruption, business interests where interests are in the shareholders, not the country's national security interest, and the like?
No, I think that is a piece of it. I think you can either narrow it too much and become perhaps too conspiratorial, which you weren't doing, or you can broaden it to what are also legitimate state interests based on the economic health of their population. And those clearly play. It would be a mistake to look at probably any state and consider its foreign policy actions only in terms of its political interests or its security interests. And you're certainly seeing that very clearly now. I mean, the Europeans have about 30% of their natural gas coming from Russia. And there are no fast fixes if that gas doesn't come. It's not going to come. I go into some detail here, but, you're several years away from where the investment in fracking and construction of LNG plants would actually provide any relief. So Europeans, states, you could say, oh, they're cowardly, they've got that. Well, you could also say they made a mistake, but the point is they have a legitimate government interest in not having enormous economic misery for their populations and bringing their whole economies into recession, which will probably screw up our economy as well. So I think the reality is all states probably have huge tensions. Policy is made at the intersection of competing forces, economic writ large, economic writ small, sometimes corruption, sometimes multiple security interests. Any question you look at, you could begin to layer those in. And I think that's an important point you raised, because when we talk about either our interests or foreign interests, so often you'll hear people say, well, we just have to get our priorities right. I would submit to you that statement fundamentally misunderstands policy, because in most cases we have multiple interests. And the problem is not to put them in some kind of order that is immutable, but to advance multiple interests. It's a really simplistic case, Egypt. We have an interest in maintaining the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty that's kept the region out of a major war for 30 years. We have the economic health of the United States involved in the free passage of oil and other commodities through the Suez Canal. That's not a piece of hypocrisy. What government is not responsible for the fundamental health of its people?
and we have a certain interest in democracy. Those are all legitimate interests. So the creation of policy is not a function of having some ranking order that says we sacrifice everything else for number one, because if you don't have number one, you don't have a first priority. Well, that's fine if you're having an action list for cleaning up your supply shed. It's not a way to make foreign policy. And your problem is to balance the tension and try to advance multiple interests. And those tensions are everywhere. Thank you.
All right, Jonas, you got it.
Yeah, well, we have one particular, I think, very pleasant, I call it obligation duty to present to you General Gray's book.
Thank you.
And more is coming, you know, but his legacy and leadership obviously will continue forever. And I thought this would be useful, particularly also in addition to your diplomatic achievements and academic, you played obviously an important role in the military. So
thank you.
So this is the book. You have a flyer, I think, in the package, and the other book, I think, it's something to do with Al Qaeda, and this is one of the longest wars that the international community is fighting, and a few other, I think, publications. And
this should keep you out of trouble.
Yeah, well, I think, as we say academically, it's not the end, it's the beginning.
Yes.
So thank you again, and I would like to move on with a very distinguished panel, and we'll continue to have a dialogue. So very quickly, I need my glasses, otherwise I don't see myself. At any rate, I think I would like to move on in terms of the program. We have a panel, and I asked them to make some very brief comments, and then we'll develop a dialogue. The first one is Dr. Richard Weitz, who is the Director and Senior Fellow, the Center of Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. On a personal, professional level, I'm delighted that Richard is here because he contributed a very important chapter on Afghanistan to our forthcoming book on NATO. So if you want to come up here, Richard, or you want to sit there or whatever?
Probably logistically easier if I could stay
Okay.
here.
So go ahead.
And I'm going to keep listening. I just want to get a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
I didn't want you to think I was walking.
Good. No, though you've already done your damage, though, you preempted many of my observations.
We
kind
can
of
get
better
your
than I
coffee.
can,
Get
so
your
I'm putting
coffee.
all over the call.
Sure.
But that said,
Yeah,
I'm gonna what I thought I was gonna give a geopolitical overview of some of the issues involved. But since the ambassador did such a good job, I'm just going to focus on the two countries I know best, which would be pretty much Russia and China. It seems to me that Russia has developed, unlike China, has developed a strategy for how it's going to approach the withdrawal of NATO forces and American forces from Afghanistan in the next 2 years. Are we okay audio, by the way? Can you hear me, everybody? Okay. The Russians are clearly cross-pressured, like the Chinese, over how they're looking at what's happening in Afghanistan. You see a lot of unease no matter what the U.S. does. So when the Obama administration came in, there was an initial surge of troops. The Russians were very concerned that the large number was greater than you would need for what they thought was a counterinsurgency campaign, and they were worried that the U.S. was basically just trying to establish a major foothold in the heart of Eurasia for other purposes, and they were very cautious about keeping track of efforts by the United States to obtain permanent bases in the region. And you saw this previously with their mixed approach to what was happening with the U.S. bases in other countries. So as far as we understand it, they played some role in encouraging the Uzbeks to ask the U.S. forces to leave in 2005. And our ambassador, former ambassador to Russia, said confirm what we had heard in the open source, that there was a bit of a bidding game between the Americans and the Russians over how long the United States could remain in the Kyrgyz Republic. But we have a Kyrgyz expert on the panel, so I'll let him talk about, if he wants, what happened with Manas and so on. Clearly, the Russians, on the other hand, have not been unhappy to see the United States engaged in fighting the Taliban. As they quite obviously would tell you, they'd rather have us do it than them. So it's convenient for us to go in and fight the enemies of Russia. As long as they would like it, as we do that and then leave. Now we are leaving, but now their complaint's a bit different. Is that we're leaving too soon. And I haven't seen much reaction to what's happening with President Obama's recent announcement. But what little I have seen is echoing what we heard before, when it looked like the U.S. forces would leave in 2014, this year, rather than 2016, which is it's premature. The Afghan National Security Forces aren't able to manage the Taliban threat without a sense of NATO assistance. There's already a major problem with regional terrorism, narcotics trafficking, and other sources of instability affecting Central Asia and Russia. This will make it worse. I was in Moscow last month as the Ministry of Defense has their annual conference. They had their expert brief us on what their military intelligence thinks is going to be the likely results of Afghanistan, and they put it pretty much that there's a third chance, that 1 out of 3 chance that the country will be able to pretty much look at the situation, look as it does now, even with a reduced NATO presence. But they thought there was also a good chance that it would fall apart. The Taliban would gain control over much of the country and then use that as a base of operations to export social revolutions elsewhere. And then the third, which I'll get to later, is the possibility of the country breaking apart into ethnic enclaves. The Russians have adopted multiple lines of action to deal with this threat. The first is they've been developing their own economic and military ties with Afghanistan. Because of what happened during the Soviet occupation, neither they nor the Afghans wanted the Russians to be heavily involved in the country. There's been when Karzai became president, he made sure not to go to Moscow. He went pretty much everywhere else. The Russians, though, in the last few years have become more involved. Initially, they were testing the waters with some joint counter-narcotics operations with the U.S. forces. Since then, they've become more involved in rebuilding some of their own former Soviet factories. They're helping to provide some helicopters and rifles and other weapons to the Afghan armed forces and so on. And Karzai, before he left office, or as he is in the process of leaving office, has indicated that he was very enthusiastic about ties with Russia. As he's been alienated from the Obama administration, he's turned to Russia as the Russians have turned to him. And you will recall that Afghanistan is one of the few countries that recognized Moscow's annexation of the Crimea, which shows how deep their ties have become. In addition, the Russians have been expanding their bases in Central Asia. They have an extensive basing complex in the Kyrgyz Republic. Again, I'll defer to our colleague on that. They've also been developing security ties with Tajikistan, helping to reestablish the Afghan-Tajik border defenses, selling subsidized weapons to Kazakhstan, which doesn't need the aid. They can afford to buy the weapons, and so on. And all these governments are very alarmed by what's happening in Afghanistan, and as the ambassador said, they're looking to Russia to provide them with security assistance. The third line of action is Russia's been trying to develop some regional security architecture to manage this threat. This is focused on the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, which has been very involved in some kind of counterterrorism and counter-narcotics activities. They're developing their collective capacity to intervene in another, not in Afghanistan itself, but in a Central Asian country that might come under threat from Afghan-based insurgents. But that's still a bit of much of a work in progress, and they haven't been able to do what they really would like, which is get NATO to cooperate with the CSTO. The NATO position is that this is a tool which Russia uses to maintain dominance of the region, so they prefer to deal bilaterally with the Central Asian government. The Russians have also been trying to build up the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The SCO, at times, early in the Obama administration, they made an effort trying to engage with it. It looked like it could play an important role in helping to provide some kind of support to Afghanistan. And in 2012, they actually gave Afghanistan special observer status. But so far, it's made a lot of declarations and conference and stuff. It hasn't really done much. Where it could be useful is helping to integrate Afghanistan, the regional economy, and just decided not to do that. Russia's also been seeking to strengthen its ties with the great powers and regional powers, and I'll go into that in a second. But the fallback Russian strategy has been, and this is pretty obvious in the last few months, they are prepared to go back to the 1990s and to start recarving spheres of influence in Afghanistan. They would have what the defense minister called territorial formations. The military intelligence person we heard in May said there's about 31% chance of it breaking up, and so what they're thinking of is just relying on the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and some in the north to serve as a buffer from the Pashtun-dominated Taliban in the south. In terms of the great powers, they've managed to improve their relations somewhat with Pakistan. More so with India. That's been the most receptive partner. The Afghan situation has been a second kick to the more of an Indian Moscow alliance that we saw during the Cold War. Sort of faded in recent years with the Indians trying to diversify their ties. But it's now been Afghanistan's helping to revive that. And we saw recently an interesting arms deal by which the Indians will buy arms for Afghanistan from Russia, and the Russians deliver them, and plus whatever training and so on. And this circumvents the problems Indians have with lack of territorial connections with Afghanistan and concerns about Pakistan, how that might retaliate. If you do it through Russia, that limits the extent to which the Pakistanis might retaliate, they think. Iran is, so far, has remained a bit aloof from Russia and vice versa, but that would be the logical reconstitution of the 1990s Northern Alliance ties, which involved Iran, India, and Russia back in the Northern Alliance. And so I think we might see that now that they have a more receptive Iranian government. Where Russia has had great difficulty, as have we, has been with China. The Chinese, as far as I see it, have four interests involved in what's happening in Afghanistan. Working outward, the main is to buffer what's happening there from affecting China itself, particularly Xinjiang. They're concerned about narcotics trafficking, which is the main Russian concern, but also about encouraging of Islamist militarism, having that find support for what they call these Turkmenistan terrorist groups in Uyghur-dominated parts of China. And so they've been very vigilant against that. More positively, they're hoping that by integrating Xinjiang into the regional economy of Central Asia, that will help raise prosperity, improve conditions there. The second main interests are Chinese economic interests in Afghanistan. As you know, a few years ago, out of almost nothing, the Chinese suddenly started buying up very valuable, potentially valuable deposits of copper and oil field and so on in Afghanistan. And the thinking was Chinese saw an opportunity that the other countries were reluctant to exploit because of the security conditions, and the Chinese would be able to benefit from that. That hasn't really occurred. Those projects are still remain on hold because it turns out the Chinese managers are just as fearful as Western ones about going in and putting their safety at risk about in a country where the security is unsure. And there's been some delays in the Afghan legislature about ratifying the necessary agreements and so on. So those projects are still on hold, but potentially it's a source of economic benefit for China if they get stability there. And then more broadly, the third one would be Central Asia. Central Asia, and Pakistan, the Chinese security and economic interests there are greater than Afghanistan, but they understand that Afghanistan, if the situation deteriorates so badly there, it'll make it more difficult to protect Chinese interests in Central Asia and Pakistan, particularly since the ties of Pakistan have been frayed already by links between the Pakistani government and terrorist groups, some of which have been active in China, according to the Chinese. The last core interest, which is decreasing, is not just the United States. The Obama administration came in, made clear Afghanistan is probably one of its most important foreign policy interests. The Chinese have been not confronting the United States over its policies in Afghanistan. They've not contested the UN mandates that have authorized continuing Western forces there. A lot of the earlier fears that you saw about containment, encirclement, and so on, under Obama, they haven't really stressed that. But they are very concerned now about the U.S. withdrawal. And you talk to the Chinese, and you definitely get the impression, which is shared by the Russians, that we're basically pulling out and dumping this problem on them. We broke the country, and now we're leaving, and they're going to have to figure out how to deal with it. Now, logically, Russia and China will cooperate. Right now, they've got a good relationship in which Russia encourages the Chinese to develop the region economically, and the Chinese defer to Russia's security preeminence. But that might change. The Chinese are a bit unsure whether the Russians have the capacity to maintain security in Central Asia and basically contain whatever problems in Afghanistan by themselves. And if that fails to do so, the Chinese have some difficult questions ahead about how deeply involved they want to become in the region. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. We'll come back to some of the issues that you raised that are really important. For example, the cooperation between China and Russia to combat terrorism on the additional fire arrangements and all that. But what I suggest, since we do have other panelists, they should have their say and to try to then develop a discussion on it. Panelists, and you have, of course, all the bios, so I'm not going to go into details. Again, Professor Amit Kumar is well known here because he participated in many of our seminars before. He's a professor at Georgetown, and he's affiliated with other universities like George Mason and so on. His specialization relates to the financial, which is, as we say, the oxygen. Others said that fuel that keeps the terrorists going, let's say, in the resurgence and all that, and the economic social development. So why don't you briefly make a few points and we'll move on.
Sure. I want to thank General Gray and Yona for giving me the opportunity to come to such a distinguished audience and such a wonderful panel. And I want to thank His Excellency Ambassador Newman for laying out an interesting roadmap for the discussion. And again, I would say, at the risk of repetition, preempting a lot of what I was going to say. Of course, Richard did some of that too. So I'll be necessarily perforce have to be short because I won't repeat a lot of what they said. I'm going to take care of you. Yeah, I'm going to lay down some observations that I have, and we can have assessments later, more in detail, and more fleshed out discussion. Firstly, since my purported specialization is terrorist financing and terrorism, I'm going to focus a little more on what the ambassador said and what Richard echoed some of it as well, more on terrorist financing and terrorism, and also on how that relates to the geopolitical and the strategic picture in the region. Firstly, the Al-Qaeda-Taliban nexus remains. Most people tend to say that the Al-Qaeda-Taliban nexus in Afghanistan has been ruptured, and we have the UN kind of splitting the two Al-Qaeda and the Taliban lists 3 years ago, which I find a little bit amazing and unrealistic, because if you look at, yes, the core Al-Qaeda has been decimated to a large extent, but the Al-Qaeda associated groups in Afghanistan, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Afghan Taliban, Houthi, as well as others still remain. And they fight alongside the Afghan Taliban and the Haqqani network in all the battles against the coalition troops. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind when we say the Al-Qaeda-Taliban nexus has been ruptured. That's not really a truism, and that does not reflect the ground realities. Secondly, we have this artificial, I would say, distinction between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistan Taliban. Now, interestingly enough, both the Talibans on both the sides of the border are close to each other historically. They have ethnic ties, they have cultural ties, they crisscross the border and help each other. And just because the Pakistan Taliban is against the Pakistani government, the Afghan Taliban against the Afghan government, we tend to make more of an artificial distinction between the two. In reality, they're pretty close, actually. They're ethnic Pashtuns on both sides of the border, and it's a porous border, as all of us have been reading and knowing for a long time. Thirdly, when we talk about select targeted strikes against, the terrorists in Waziristan, we hear about Pakistanis going only after the Pakistani Taliban, and a bit of the East Turkestan Islamic movement, which is linked to the Uyghur rebellion in China, Xinjiang province. There are the Lashkar-e-Taiba of the world, the Jaish-e-Mohammed of the world, the Harakat al-Mujahideens of the world, the Houthis of the world, the Haqqani networks of the world, which are pretty much part of that terrorist mix. So when we say that we're going to extirpate terrorism in Pakistan or elsewhere, we need to deal with all the groups concerned and not selectively target the Pakistani Taliban. So that's the reality that has to be factored in terms of seeing the threat from terrorist groups, the existential threat, I would add. Also, Indians are really worried about the threat from all these terrorist groups, the Haqqanis, the Lashkar-e-Taibas, and the offshoot of Lashkar-e-Taiba in India, the Indian Mujahideen, actually being very active once the coalition troops leave at the end of 2016 or even sooner. And there are increasing infiltrations into Kashmir already. So that's something that the Indians are concerned about, and the Afghans are concerned about also. Once the coalition troops leave, what's going to become of them? They face this threat from the Haqqani network. They face this threat from the Afghan Taliban, which because of the power vacuum and the strategic vacuum, I would say, caused by the exit of coalition troops, will become more bolder and will kind of compromise the strategic interests and the peace and stability and security of both Afghanistan and India. Also, I already mentioned about the ETIM, or the East Turkestan Islamic Movement threat to China, and China is really concerned about that in its own way. Also, Uzbekistan and the other Central Asian republics are concerned about the threat from the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, or IMU, or its offshoot, the Islamic Jihad Movement, Union. So they might become stronger as a result of the exit of coalition troops as well. Talking about China and India, both, as Richard mentioned, have strong investment interests. Chinese in the copper mines, and the Indians in iron ore, and investment in roads and so on and so forth. Namely, the Aignak copper mines close to Kabul, and the Hajikak iron ore mines for India. So their investment prospects may be threatened by the continued presence of terrorist groups and terrorist threats per se. One thing more that most people mistake to note or do not really notice, that the threat of Talibanization in Pakistan has already come to fruition actually, because if you see what happened in Karachi, there is a presence of the Pakistani Taliban and the Al-Qaeda linked elements in Karachi as well. And a lot of millions of Pashtuns have migrated from Afghanistan, eastern and south Afghanistan, to Karachi. And in Karachi, as we've seen with the recent attack, the airports and courts and so on and so forth, there is ethnic tension of the Pashtuns that are migrated, and the ethnic Mujahids, or Muhajirs rather, who are migrants from the Indian side of the continent in 1947. So you have these ethnic tensions, you have provincial tensions, you have Shia-Sunni tensions in Pakistan. So there are a lot of things going on in Pakistan also, along with Afghanistan, and threats to India that need to be taken care of, actually. I would say that there is also a pronounced threat of the intersection of organized and petty crime with terrorism and terrorist financing. You see the drug trafficking that a lot of the speakers already mentioned. Drugs are sort of transported from Afghanistan in three ways, essentially. A good deal goes to Iran, so Iran faces the drug threat along with the threat of migrants from the western part of Afghanistan. The Pakistanis take a huge brunt of the drug transport also towards their end. Recently, there's been the Indian state of Punjab. There's been a lot of influx of drugs there as well, on the northwestern side of India. And also the Central Asian republics, as was mentioned earlier as well, have been affected adversely by the drug flow. So the drug flow is essentially in three directions: towards Pakistan, towards Iran, and towards the Central Asian republics. The South Asian states in general, and here I'm also talking a little bit about the Central Asian states, but generally more focusing on the South Asian states, are characterized by lack of political will, lack of technical capacity, porous borders, poor customs and border patrol measures, and that sort of allows for easy transport of essentially three things: drugs, terrorists, and arms and equipment. So that's kind of something that the counter-terrorist officials in South Asian nations need to be careful about and concentrate on, actually. I would say another important problem, which is a systemic problem in Afghanistan, is the corruption element, with white swaths of the political elite actually being very corrupt, actually. And one case in point is the lack of the inability on the part of the Afghan government to come with a real solid anti-money laundering law, which could take care of the problems caused by the sort of run on the Kabul bank, where a lot of the political elites vanquished with close to $800 million or so a few years back. And despite the Financial Action Task Force, which is the international watchdog of the world, really, when it comes to anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism measures, despite their warning the Afghans, it's only yesterday when the Afghan Senate really passed the law, and it still has to be ratified and signed by the Afghan president. For some reason or the other, the Afghan government has been dilly-dallying, and the deadline was Monday, actually. So they're right in the nick of time. They're cobbling together a hastily framed anti-money laundering law, which may not be adequate, really, to check money laundering and to really make sure that the run on banks like the Kabul bank is not repeated. I would also look at the interests of Iran, drugs, migration, but also since Pakistan has been going through a lot of instability, the Indians as well as the Russians and the Chinese and all want I would say kind of a path through Iran, and Indians have been working on developing the Chabar port, actually, on the southeastern tip of Iran. And the Chinese always really play a confusing game. On one hand, they're trying to make sure that they have access to Central Asia and to Iran. On the other hand, they have developed the Gwadar port in Pakistan also to have access to the Indian Ocean. So it's really important to note what the Chinese are doing. And of course, the Chinese are pretty active in trying to sort of envision and to create the new Silk Route, actually, all the way from Xinjiang province in China, central China, Xinjiang province in China, Central Asia, and then Iran, Iraq, Syria, and so on and so forth. So one reason why they want the Central Asian republics, in addition to the terrorism threat, is the fact that they want a free ride, really, something like a customs union and more, rather, to really make sure that Central Asia is used to their economic and commercial advantage. I would really end quickly by saying I completely agree with Ambassador Newman that the progress in Afghanistan, as far as we are concerned, has to be piecemeal. You're very right in pointing out, Ambassador, that we must not go in for a peace deal. We must engage in a consistent peace process, actually. And we need to make sure that the Afghanistan is secure, make sure it's stable, to make sure it has democracy, make sure it develops and sucks in a lot of investment internationally, which really can result in developing it, not kind of resulting in corruption and so on and so forth. So if we are not careful and turn our eyes away from Afghanistan and Pakistan and South Asia in general, we may have to repeat what we went through after 1988 when the Soviet troops withdrew, and we didn't look at South Asia for 13 years almost and see what happened. The Taliban rose, and the rest of the same history, 9/11 and 2 wars and so on and so forth. So you're very right in pointing out that the kind of strategy we employ in Afghanistan has to be careful, considerate, and has to be long-term. When we talk about the bilateral security agreement, how do we flesh it out, actually? What are the real contours of the agreement? Are we looking at only counterterrorism assistance? Are we looking at special force deployment? Are we looking at advising and training? Because obviously the Indians and the Chinese are engaged in training the Afghan national security officers also. So what kind of engagement do we have with South Asia? Of course, it can't be military to the extent it's been already, but in terms of counterterrorism, in terms of soft power, in terms of maybe investment. Similarly, in addition to Afghanistan, do we have to look at Central Asia also? Or do we leave Central Asia to the contrivances of the Chinese and the Russians? Because we have economic interests in addition to the geopolitical interests in Central Asia also. For example, Turkmenistan is rich in natural gas, oil. So those are important interests to keep in mind. I'll end with this, but I must again thank Yona and General Gray and the Ambassador Richard and all the other panelists to come for really a very absorbing and a very incisive discussion. And it's difficult to do in 2 hours, do the entire stretch of South Asia, Central Asia, East Asia, and West Asia also. So it's more like an Asian seminar, which makes it really robust. So thank you.
Thank you very much. As I said correctly, I mean, I think the topic deserves much more time, and it reminds me 15 years ago that Mike Sweatnam and myself, we had the opportunity to go to Kashmir and do some interviewing with the so-called International Brigade from all over the world coming to fight in Kashmir. And now we see again, we are witnessing the foreign fighters all over the place, whether it is in Iraq or Syria or the Islamic Jihad and so on. So I really think we have to pay close attention to ponder these issues. I want to move on to our colleague Ash Drian, who is currently at the International Law Institute, and is a colleague of us with Professor Don Wallace, myself. And he has a very rich background all the way with the State Department and the Senate and think tanks and so forth. And I asked him to share some of his views and experiences on this subject.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Thanks again, Yona, for giving me the opportunity to join this very distinguished panel. It's been a rich and interesting discussion. I'm going to try to keep my remarks very brief in the interest of time. I know we have a couple of more speakers and we want to leave some time for questions. As Yona mentioned, I spent several years at the State Department, primarily at the policy planning staff, which gave me an opportunity to work with colleagues on some very serious range of strategic challenges. This was during the end of the Bush administration and into the beginning of the Obama administration. Afghanistan, as we've heard already, since 9/11 has clearly been one of the most difficult challenges that the United States has been facing. And I think we've gotten a good sense of the challenges and the regional context of those challenges today. What I wanted to do is just lay out briefly a couple of scenarios as to how the situation in Afghanistan might play out and evolve over the coming years. The United States has had basically three fundamental objectives with regard to Afghanistan since 9/11. One, of course, was to capture or kill senior al-Qaeda leadership and those responsible for the 9/11 attacks and subsequent attacks. The second was to ensure that Afghanistan could no longer be used as a safe haven from which to conduct terrorist attacks against the United States or its allies. And finally, to support a democratically elected government in maintaining control of its territory and defeating the Taliban insurgency. By and large, U.S. efforts have been successful in meeting the first of these two objectives. Senior al-Qaeda leadership, as we all know, has been removed from Afghanistan. The Osama bin Laden has been killed. The globally capable network that existed before 9/11 has been decimated. Secondly, the safe haven has been largely eliminated, at least in terms of its ability to carry out direct attacks against the United States. But it's this last objective that remains elusive. The Afghan government is still very much fighting to maintain control of its territory. The Taliban remains a formidable fighting force. At the same time, the government has held on. It's still very much in power in terms of a functioning government that just recently held a spate of democratic elections. But as we heard, there are competing forces and violence and instability that makes Afghanistan a very challenging environment. So as I see it looking forward, there are three scenarios that we should be looking for as U.S. combat forces withdraw at the end of the year. First is what I would call the status quo scenario, which is the Afghan government largely continues to retain control of its territory, but the Taliban maintains its ability to fight and challenge the stability of the government, creating a lot of havoc and violence and attacks that will continue to cause great distress to the civilian population. But at the end of the day, the government sort of muddles on, struggles to battle the insurgency, and we just see the status quo continuing. Then we have what I'd say is sort of the worst case scenario, which is the resurgence of the Taliban and their ability to expand its campaign of violence, which at some point results in the government losing control over large swaths of territory, and in which the Taliban are able to set up a parallel government or eventually even wrest control from the central authority in Afghanistan, and then the country devolves into one of the panelists mentioned in terms of regional enclaves. This would be a strategic defeat for U.S. policy, because it could allow Afghanistan to once again become a safe haven for terrorists, and all the effort, the sacrifice, and blood and treasure that the United States has invested over the years would have been wasted. The unfolding situation in Iraq that's playing out today is a precursor, I think, to the kind of worst-case scenario that we might see take place in Afghanistan if the government is unable to maintain its position on the battlefield and see sort of the situation devolve. And then the best-case scenario, the third scenario, would be one in which the Afghan government succeeds over time in weakening the Taliban and the other al-Qaeda-affiliated groups that have been mentioned. The hope would be that the Afghan forces are stronger and more cohesive than their Iraqi counterparts have demonstrated so far, and that it forces the Taliban to enter into some kind of negotiated political framework where they agree to lay down their arms and accept the legitimacy of the government, perhaps in exchange for some recognition of a political role in Afghan's future. Now, that's the outcome that the United States and its allies would obviously prefer. At the moment, I wouldn't say it's the most probable, at least not in the short run. but just I wanted to offer a couple of thoughts on what conditions would need to be in place for making this best case scenario more likely. First, I would argue is a continued and robust U.S. military presence. President Obama indicated that he's going to retain about 10,000 troops in Afghanistan next year, which will dwindle down to 5,000 after that, and pull out entirely after 2016. Even for this limited 2-year presence, it's going to require the new government in Afghanistan to sign on to a security status of forces agreement, and the troops will need to, it will require that, well, I guess the purpose of these troops will be, first of all, to create a competent training and sort of a backup force that can assist Afghan security forces, particularly if we see the Taliban gaining ground in particular regions. The second purpose of these forces is deterrence. A continuous force presence, a U.S. force presence, makes it more likely that the Taliban will eventually decide it's no longer worth prolonging the insurgency. And I think President Obama's announcement that all troops will leave in 2016 is completely counterproductive. It's short-sighted, and it just gives the Taliban a target date in which to wait and regroup and begin a new assault against the government once they think they'll have a better shot if that date sticks. The second condition that would make the best case outcome more likely is one we've heard a lot about today already, and that has to do with cooperation from Afghanistan's regional neighbors, particularly Pakistan. The Pakistani government has to do more to prevent the border crossings of equipment and personnel, and strengthen their ability to identify those Taliban fighters, to limit their ability to regroup and resupply. Continuing economic and political assistance from India, as we've heard, will be important, as will Russian support, which has been limited, but they have been helpful in terms of economic assistance and weapons in some ways. And finally, as we've heard again, that Iran stays out of Afghanistan and doesn't undermine the government for its own ends. And finally, the third area where we'd have to see progress will depend a lot on the new Afghan government itself. The election of a new president will offer an opportunity to create a more positive relationship with the West and the donor community than we've seen under Karzai. There's some hope with this first peaceful transfer of power that this can happen. It'll require the emergence of a competent, strong, and inclusive leader who can bring together the various factions to continue the morale, to take on the fight against the Taliban, hopefully limit corruption and expand trust in government that will engender a cooperative relationship with the United States and the West. This is a tall order. It's a lot to expect, certainly in the short run, but I think it's still possible to work and achieve this best case scenario, and we'll have to see how the situation develops over the coming months. I'll stop there and look forward to it.
Thank you again, Ash, for your remarks, and we'll come back to some of the issues that you raised. We're very fortunate to have with us someone from the region, the brother region. We have Lieutenant Colonel Kambarov, who is now a Fulbright scholar at the Police Foundation, and we had some discussions before. He also has a PhD in law from the Police Academy of Russia in Moscow, and in addition he studied in Japan. So I think he has a very broad perspective on what's happening on the ground, and I asked him to share with us his analysis very briefly because we want to develop the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Yona, for the invitation. I'm very honored to be a part of this distinguished panel. I'll focus on terrorism in Central Asian Kyrgyzstan, based in Kyrgyzstan. So, with a short background of the terrorist organization. A number of fundamental organizations operate actually in Central Asia, and most of them were concentrated in Fergana Valley, which is part of which is part of, as you can see on the map, encompasses the territory of South Kyrgyzstan, North Tajikistan, and East Uzbekistan, with an overall area of 22,000 square kilometers and the population more than 11 million. And Islam has always had a great influence there. And after being identified and tracked by some of Central Asian governments, some ambiguous, fundamental, I would say, radical movements resisted and later turned into terrorist organizations like the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan in 1996 and its offshoot Islamic Jihad Union in 2002. So the conventional turning point for the emergence of terrorism in Central Asia is terrorist attack in Tashkent in February 16, 1999, when the IMU, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, organized its unsuccessful attempt to assassinate the president of Uzbekistan. And before this attempt was taken, the IMU basically fled from Uzbekistan security forces into Tajikistan. There, as you can remember, there was a civil war or conflict between the government and the opposition in Tajikistan from 1993 to 1997. So they joined to on the side and fought on the side of United Tajik opposition, and they gained experience there pretty well, like many radicalized individuals do in Syria today. After the February 1999 bombing in Tashkent, IMU fled to Afghanistan during the Uzbekistan crackdown on radicals. And some members of the IMU took attempts to penetrate into South Kyrgyzstan twice in the summers of 1999 and 2000. And once there, they took many hostages, they began to take many hostages and releasing them after the negotiations. And Kyrgyz military forces pushed them out, but it took several months because of their terrorist tactics and mountainous areas. This event showed how difficult it had become to provide security in Kyrgyzstan and overall in Central Asia. Later, the Islamic Jihad Union, first known to outsiders as just Islamic Jihad Group, organized suicide bombings in Uzbekistan, in Bukhara, and Tashkent in March and April 2004. They also claimed responsibility for coordinated bombing attacks in Tashkent on July 30, 2004 against the Israeli and American embassies and the Uzbekistan prosecution office in Tashkent. When the United States armed forces invaded in Afghanistan after September 11, 2001, the invasion heavily disrupted the IMU members who was fighting, who was operating there in Afghanistan along with Taliban. But the IMU didn't disappear. On the contrary, they claimed responsibility for an ambush that killed 27 soldiers, officially 27 soldiers, in the Rash Valley of Tajikistan in September 19, 2010. IMU members also claimed responsibility for carrying out an attack on Karachi International Airport just recently in June 8, 2014. Thus, these two terrorist organizations, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan and Islamic Jihad Union, present or pose a real threat, terrorist external threat, I would say, to Central Asian security. As for the internal threat, every Central Asian state has local radical organizations, and many have their ties between each other. And the first, if we speak about Kyrgyzstan, the first homegrown terrorist in Central Asia and in Kyrgyzstan was Jaish-ul-Mahdi, the Army of Righteous Ruler. It was formed in 2010 and under the influence of terrorists from Russian Caucasia. The leader of this Jaish-ul-Mahdi was Kyrgyz citizen Saradbek Islam, to whom all members swore bayat, allegiance. And all members were radicalized through the internet and basically from the websites of IMU, Nigeria, and other Russian Caucasian terrorist groups and websites. The end goal of Jaish-ul-Mahdi was to overthrow the Caucasus regime in Kyrgyzstan and establishment of caliphate in Kyrgyzstan and Central Asia overall. To achieve the goal, Jaish al-Mahdi organized some acts which really resembled common crime, murdering civic people and policemen, and carrying out some robberies. So Jaish al-Mahdi posted videos on the internet where they declared jihad in Kyrgyzstan and hoping to draw attention and financing from the international terrorist organization. And members of Jaish al-Mahdi at the same time conducted recruiting activities to enlarge their organization and disseminate radical ideas among the youngsters in Kyrgyzstan. There are now 13 terrorist organizations officially recognized in Kyrgyzstan, but about 80% of the radical movement are members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is not recognized as a terrorist organization in Kyrgyzstan, but as an extremist organization. But is recognized as a terrorist organization in Russia and other Central Asian states. Though the Hizb ut-Tahrir officially declares that they do not use violence, there's a subtle line between this extremist organization and other terrorist organizations. For example, the terrorist group Akramiya, which operated in Fergana Valley, was established by Akram Yudashev and his followers, all former members of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And adherents of Hizb ut-Tahrir privately recognized a willingness to use any violence in reaching their goal, that is, to overthrow secular government and the establishment of caliphate. An analysis by the Kyrgyz Interior Ministry found that while religious extremist groups in Kyrgyzstan had 1.1% women in 2003, by 2013, women made up 23% of the group. Most are whites and relatives of men who espouse radical extremist ideas. The leadership of Hizb ut-Tahrir is now working to coordinate women in its activities, and this new approach is actively implemented in neighboring countries, Uzbekistan also. And an increasing number of women from Kyrgyzstan between 18 and 25 years old are now being actively radicalized and recruited by various terrorist groups to join terrorist groups in Syria. At least 10 women from Kyrgyzstan are known to be part of religious extremists or terrorists in Syria today. Although there are many shortfalls in the counterterrorism ability of security forces of Kyrgyzstan, they thwarted many plots. And police, my background in internal ministry status police in my country, so police started to deal with terrorism and extremism about 10 years ago, and there was a thick wall between intelligence and police in terms of sharing information and combating terrorism. However, it is much better today when cooperation between these two agencies started to become more collaborative. Nevertheless, they need financial and technical support. There's also lack of strong experts in theology. Even so, security forces have had some success in combating terrorism and extremism in Kyrgyzstan. Kyrgyzstan went through two coups in March 2005 and April 2010, and research shows that extremist organizations are able to take advantage of political instability for their own purposes. And maintaining political stability is vital, as well as willingness to fight against terrorism and extremism. And if another coup occurs in Kyrgyzstan in future, extremists may be able to take over parliament and seize state power, and causing a further deterioration not only in Kyrgyzstan but in Central Asia as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your overview. About 2 years ago, we had a seminar in Bishkek in regard to the border security, terrorism, the hard power, but also looking at the soft power. The OSCE, for example, maintains the police and community relations, and the question of democracy. We'll come back to it. And finally, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our colleague, Professor Bob Turner, who is Associate Director of the Center for National Security Law the University of Virginia School of Law. We partner on some of these events. I would like to mention also the excellent study that he and his colleague John Moore produced. You have a flyer in the package that you can look at, looking at the rule of law in combating terrorism. So, Bob, can you make some quick, I think, statement before we turn it off to discussion?
Sure, Yona. I want to thank you and Al Gray for your excellent comments and also for putting together another outstanding panel. I'm not an expert on the region. I've written about Southeast Asia, but most of that was 40 years or more ago. I want to talk a little bit about America, because I think America is going to be part of the end to this. Whether it's a good end or a bad end, we're either going to play a positive role or we are going to watch bad things happen in the region. Sun Tzu reminds us that the acting of skill is not winning 100 victories in 100 battles, but rather subduing the enemy without fighting. We're talking about deterrence. Deterrence is a function of two perceptions, strength and will. No one in the region doubts that America has the strength to defeat any country in Asia. Certainly, if we're not counting China, it's not close. The problem is, since Vietnam, there have been great doubts about our will. And we've made lots of mistakes that have contributed to that. Ash made the point that announcing in advance that we're going to pull our troops out at 18 months was not a helpful move. Indeed, I would say it almost guaranteed us defeat in the area. We told our friends, you remember what the Americans did to South Vietnam when they got tired of the war? And we told our enemies, hey, 18 months, you can hold your breath for 18 months, just hang around, and when the Americans leave, you can terrorize people again. Indeed, I think when I heard the president announce we were going to pull out within 18 months, which was a political move to appease the left wing of his own political base, I said, we just lost a war, and I hope I've proven wrong by that. This is an unusual war. It's a war that depends upon two things. It depends upon intelligence, first of all. There's no question about whether our tanks or our armored divisions or our carrier battle groups can defeat Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. We're stronger than they are. The issue here is one of will. And I think on that aspect, one of the most important things America needs to do is to get united, to understand that we go into this as a country, we win or lose as a country. There was a man named Arthur Vandenberg, who was a U.S. Senator from Michigan, who coined the term bipartisanship. And he said that politics ought to stop at the water's edge. It's a tremendously important issue. 30-some-odd years ago, I was the acting Assistant Secretary of State for Congressional Relations. And it was a time when I thought that only Democrats were partisan. That was until Jimmy Carter became president, and I watched the Republicans, as soon as Sam Nunn threw down the knife he'd been trying to gut Jerry Ford with, John Tower picked it up and went right after Carter. And it just goes back and forth. There are Republican leaders in the Congress today who, when Bush was president, said the War Powers Resolution was unconstitutional and irrelevant. And then when Obama goes into Libya with UN approval, they say he's violating the Constitution and the law and so forth. If we cannot get rid of this partisanship, if we cannot convince our politicians that politics ought to stop at the water's edge, we are not going to play a positive role in the struggle for peace around the world. The maneuver a few weeks ago when we traded 5 of the top Taliban prisoners for one apparent American deserter, we sent some very bad signals around the world. We told our enemies that either we are very weak or very foolish. And we told the whole world basically that we're trying to tidy things up so we can abandon that part of the world and see how that game plays out. And without our participation, that game is not going to play out in a positive way. Our enemies can read the Gallup polls. When we went into Afghanistan, 93% of Americans supported the move. The latest polls show a majority of Americans think that was a mistake. We have an education role. We need to convince the American people that, mistake or not, we have an investment there, and if we once again abandon our commitments, no one in the world is going to take this serious. And all of this strength that we have spent trillions and trillions of dollars building up will be ineffective, because it's not just strength, it's will. And if they believe we have tremendous strength, but we're unwilling to use it, we are not going to be a force for deterring violence, aggression, and other bad things, and upholding the rule of law. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much. Did you have any comments or just a word before the general takes over?
Oh, it's been a pretty rich session. No, I don't.
Okay.
Come on, you got to.
Just to amuse
yeah,
you.
please say something.
Just to amuse you. Because there was a very excellent comment made about we shouldn't differentiate between the two Taliban, and I agree with that. But we're not alone. I mean, first of all, of course, the Pakistanis are the ones, above all, who differentiate, trying to find a way to fight the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, which they recognize now is at a state of war with the Pakistanis, while still trying to maintain influence across the other. I am not certain that you won't at some point see the Afghans do the reverse. This is an idea the Afghans have flirted with periodically. They've flirted with the idea of giving sanctuary to Baluchi insurgents. It's a basic desire. Damn it! If you won't stop hurting me, I'm going to find a way to hurt you. And the Pakistanis certainly believe that the Afghans will allow and are allowing Tehrik Taliban Pakistan to come across the border and find sanctuary. And I don't know if it's true, but it is simply one more indication of the way that traditional behavior patterns can continue to get out of hand and make things even more dangerous than they already are. And I just thought I'd add that element of confusion to our discussions.
Well, I want to thank, on behalf of Potomac Institute, thank our distinguished speakers and panelists for another superb effort and a superb discussion. I think that obviously nothing any good is easy, and certainly the way ahead is not going to be easy. But I think today each one of the panelists in their own way described some issues which are of really great significance in terms of the way ahead. There's no question that it would be nice to have a grand strategy for the future that would take all these challenges into consideration. Such an effort, of course, would have to be adaptive, it would have to be really resilient, and it would have to be willing to make changes along the way to accommodate and to solve the various challenges. There's no question that, I mean, nothing is easy. I mean, for example, if we have a good anti-laundering program in Afghanistan now and all that, that will go a long way towards dealing with the corruption problem and but remember, that's really that starts with illegitimate kind of funding, which you launder by layering and so on, and you're the expert, I'm not, but by layering it in such a way that it can be used and become legitimate. That's totally different than funding to support terrorism, which starts out generally legitimate through charities and this and that and everything else like that, and then over time through various techniques becomes illegitimate and becomes used by terrorism. So there are no easy answers to any of these kind of challenges. We just have to really keep charging. I remember you mentioned Senator, the distinguished senator from Georgia, in your talk, and I remember having Senator Nunn on the plane with me one time. I was going to New Orleans to speak, and I was taking him home to Georgia. And I knew him really, really well when I was younger. I did a bunch of things for him in the field. And so I said, Senator, why can't we have more congressmen and senators like you who are truly statesmen, who truly look at the great interests of the country and all, and not just their own state or their own district? And he said to me, Al, you need to remember in politics, he who forgets about home goes home. And so there it was right there. And so there's nothing easy here, but I think you certainly have, all of you have pointed the way for some really, really great challenges, and we ought to continue to march and solve these challenges one at a time. Thank you all very much.
Ronald, General, before we leave, can I recognize our summer interns for 1 second to come up front, Sharon and the group? You don't have to tell stories or sing. Just, we want your name and
come right up and introduce yourself.
Where are you? Okay.
All that kind of thing.
Hi,
They love this.
Can I have it noted for the record that Yona is the best person in D.C. for this, in terms of recognizing the contribution.
So speak loudly so they can hear who you are and what you're doing and all that.
Hi, my name is Sharon Leani. I'm a research coordinator here at ICTS. I'd like to introduce our summer 2014 intern class. I'd like to introduce them and thank them for their contribution. They provide research support for Professor Alexander and help not only with this event, but many other projects that Professor Alexander coordinates. So you can all just introduce yourselves very briefly.
Aviel Hanan, University of Maryland. I'm a communication major.
I'm Gabriella Gricius. I'm from Boston University, and I'm an international affairs and German major.
Sonam Burke from the University of the Pacific in California, and I'm an international relations major.
I'm Reed Woodrum, attending Princeton University, and I'm an international and public policy major.
I am Frank Randall. I am attending St. Francis College, and I am double majoring in political science and history.
I'm Thomas Turner, and I'm studying leadership and public policy at the University of Virginia.
Hi, Andrew Du Bois. I go to Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. I'm a Middle Eastern Studies major and a history major.
I'm Tyler Engler. I'm an international politics major at Georgetown University.
I'm Uri Lerner. I just finished a master's program at SIS here at American University in U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, I just want to add that these people really, really do all the work. I drop in on the second floor quite often, and often after hours, and of course Yona is never there, and his door is closed, and nobody has seen him for 2 or 3 days. But all these people are back there in their cubicles, staring at their computer and, you know, working feverishly on whatever the hell it is you've tasked them to do. And so I really want to say you do a great job, and I'm a little bit worried that we're going to become too smart around here. You know, there's too much academic type stuff. We'll be the smartest people ever get run off a hill here if we're not careful. But we couldn't do it without you. Thank you very much. All right.
We'll take you down. We can assist you with to carry on this.
You need some help with all that stuff. I suspect a bag might